Hey, Christy.
Hey, Aaron.
So we're here to talk about the definition of art today.
Yes, we are. Now, can you do me a favor first? Yeah, there you go. Perfect. I was just seeing your forehead.
Okay.
But everyone's always seeing my forehead.
Yep. Yep.
Yes, our favorite thing, the definition of art. At least that was what really got me into philosophy of art. And as I recall, it was a big part of your formative years as a philosopher, struggling with these kinds of issues.
Yep. We should probably introduce ourselves. I'm Aaron Meskin. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Leeds.
And I'm Christy McGuire, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Houston.
Okay. All right. So we're going to talk about the definition of art. In my view, the modern discussion of the definition of art starts in the mid-1950s. There had been people who'd proposed theories of art before that. Tolstoy, for example, Collingwood, given theories of art before that. But in 1956, Morris Weitz writes this paper arguing that that art theory is never forthcoming, which is to say, by art theory he means a definition of art. So he argues in his paper that as a matter of logic, art can't be defined, and he offers a bunch of reasons for thinking this. And after that, of course, philosophers they don't follow this. Like any good issue in philosophy, as soon as Weitz argues that art can't be defined, people start spending a lot of time coming up with definitions of art, proposing definitions of art.
Right, and I think it's the Weitz article, the Weitz line is so hugely influential still to this day. So at the time, people weren't really buying into his arguments, and his arguments aren't very particularly good. It's a matter of logic that art can't have a definition in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. But the spirit's still around. Weitz argues that attempting to define art forecloses on creativity in art.
Right.
And this is the sort of he's the father of anti-essentialism in philosophy of art, which is very still very much around in contemporary philosophy of art.
Right. So Weitz offers this anti-essentialist account, says art can't be defined. He gives a bunch of different arguments. He says well, if you look and see at what we call art, you won't find anything in common. So that's one thing he says. He says, at one point he says, only mathematical and logical concepts can be defined, and art isn't a mathematical or logical concept, so it can't be defined. He points to the sub-concepts of art, like various art forms and genres, and he says, well, we're not going to find definitions there. We also can't find definitions in the case of art. And then he offers the argument, probably the key argument in the paper, which is that the defining art would be inconsistent with the expansive, adventurous, creative nature of art. If we had necessary and sufficient conditions, propose them, that's inconsistent with artists doing new things, new creative things. Of course, the way philosophers respond to Weitz is by arguing that essentialist definitions can make sense of the phenomena he's pointed to. So Mandelbaum first argues that he may be right that Weitz may be right that if you look and see, if you just look at works of art, you won't find anything in common. But that's because what artworks have in common may be some hidden relational, non-obvious feature. So there's some sort of non-manifest or latent feature that they all have in common.
Right, and I think it's with Weitz, at the very least what it shows is that philosophers' expectations should be that any attempt at a definition of art is not going to be an easy sort of thing to do, to be successful. You shouldn't expect...
perhaps the most important response to Weitz is the response by George Dickey, who developed the institutional theory in response to Weitz. Dickey argues that he can make sense of the creative, expansive, adventurous nature of art consistent with with necessary and sufficient conditions. If he appeals to the idea of a sort of a social or institutional feature, which being the thing that unifies art. So on Dickey's account, art is an institutional category. Works of art on its initial account are things that have had a certain kind of status given to them by people working on behalf of the art world.
Right. I think it's not the lure of the institutional theory isn't so much that somehow it rescues the definitional project from foreclosing on creativity. I don't think anyone really bought into that argument. The first time it was offered by Weitz, I think was it Mandelbaum that has the chess reply that there's tons of creativity in chess precisely in virtue of there being very strictly defined rules about what counts as a move, a legitimate move. So, but what I think is the really big lure of Dickey's institutional view is that it seems to be this kind of compromise where it can capture the spirit of the anti-essentialist project, in that it does seem weird that there's all the things. Think about all the things that we refer to as art. Operas, symphonies, novels, poems, films,
comic books,
paintings, comic books. It looks really tough to find any sort of unifying feature here. And what Dickey says is, I found it, and it's that they're all sort of have this kind of art status conferred on them by an appropriate art world agents, virtue of their position within an institution of art, rather than some kind of intrinsic or relational feature between the artist and work. So yeah, the institutional definition I see as the best way for those who are for whatever reason committed to essentialism to get as close as possible to anti-essentialism without going over the falls, as it is.
Okay, that's an interesting way of seeing it. Now, we'll probably come back to this later, but the debate about defining art really kicks off in the 50s with Weitz. You have Mandelbaum and Dickey responding. You have Danto, who we didn't mention, who actually coined the term the art world that Dickey picks up on. But Danto didn't really hold an institutional theory of art. You then have, in the next few decades, you have this huge project of coming up with definitions of art, and probably the most significant being the institutional theory, the historical theories by Jerry Levinson in particular also being very significant. Noel Carroll has something that's not quite a definition of art, but it's a theory of identifying art, which is also a historical account. You've got aesthetic theories that still come up. It must be said, though, that the interest in the definitional project has sort of decreased over the last decade or 15 years or so. While it was the central structuring issue in the philosophy of art, it seems, for a while, it really isn't that anymore. Don't you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think that as I recall, the last major definitional offering was from Bob Stecker in 1997. Now, Nick Zangwill has come up with an aesthetic creation theory, but I really think it has been well over a decade since we've had a really fully worked out definition of art that's been sort of debated, well debated in the literature. That's right.
Or at least a new kind. I mean, we'll just talk about this. I think we're talking about. We were going to talk a little bit more about the institutional theory. You might have had a little bit more to say about it, I think. It's interesting that the institutional theory doesn't go away, and that we've recently had lots of both defenses of the institutional theory by people like Derek Matravers and sort of re-articulations of institutional theories by people like Catherine Abel, who just developed a very different kind of institutional theory than Dickey's theory. So maybe this links back to what you were saying earlier, but it does seem like the institutional theory doesn't go away. It sort of keeps on getting resuscitated, and people are very attracted to it. I think it's precisely for the reasons I talked about earlier, that it's
the best way for an essentialist to be to approximate anti-essentialism. So while I understand the lure of institutional theory, I also think it's bullshit for a variety of reasons.
Yeah. So what are those reasons, or why do you think it's not going to work, Christy?
So I think that there's an important distinction that you first have to make, and that is, at first blush, the institutional theory makes being an artwork is sort of status in the sense of being legal or illegal, right? So in virtue of some social institution conferring some status upon an act or an object. And the question is that, just like with legality, is that supposed to be tracking anything, right? So we cross our fingers, or at least ideally we want the law to be tracking, or our legal institutions to be tracking morality. And so the question is, well, what are our art institutions supposed to be tracking? And of course, if you have a positive answer for that, then it's, well, why not put the definition in terms of that rather than status conferral institutions? And the tendency now is for the institutional theorists to say that there's nothing that they're tracking. There is no guiding principle or governing conditions about what can and cannot have the art status conferred on it. And for me, that's wildly unappealing. My inclination is to go straight to eliminativism if that's the only available option. There might as well just be there's no such thing that are artworks. They're just not it's not interesting anymore.
So two moves that people have made, recently. So there's Matraver's move where he says, look, there is no single set of reasons such that always underwrites the conferral of status, but art historical conditions always make it the case that some set of reasons at a particular time are appropriate for conferring status. And we can say that artists, there are some, there will be some reasons. Take the knight case. I take it people are knighted now for different reasons than they were 5 centuries ago. That has to do a little bit with the change in the institution, but still there are reasons why people are knighted. So that's I take it, Matraver's way of getting out what I think you were giving a version of sort of Richard Walheim's objection to the institutional theory. There's another kind of strategy. Catherine Abel's institutionalist account is very different than Dickey's account. It's not done quite in terms of conferral of status. She borrows the sort of John Searle's machinery of institutional facts to give an institutional account. Her account actually also is going to deal with some of the some other kinds of objections that I know bother you, that you have with the institutional theory. The institutional theory looks like it has difficulty explaining certain kinds of failure, right? If someone failure in making art.
That's right. That's right.
If someone puts something forward as a canister of status for appreciation, that sort of guarantees that it's going to be a work of art. All they have to do is confer the status on it. And you've argued in your recent work that can't be right. Abel's account, if you think it roughly as on her account, being a work of art is roughly like being a goal being a basket in a basketball game, right? It's something that counts as having a certain status within a particular context. She can certainly make sense of failure on her account.
Well, as far as if I'm properly understanding Catherine's account, so she thinks that what it is to be an artwork is to be the product of practices that aim at producing things that the public has perceived the art institutions to be promoting, right? That the point of art institutions is to promote these things, and it's the public's perception of this. So it's and it's not at all clear whether, in fact, she can account for things that, in fact, end up failing to promote that, right? So I make the distinction between there's failure to be good art, right? Artworks that fail to realize their aims in particularly good ways, right? But what I'm interested in is things that are non-art, right? So in that sense of failure, that they fail to be art at all. And it's not
Yeah.
clear to me that how Catherine's account can deal with that, and at least in any robust sense.
I think we disagree here on this. I don't think her view has any trouble making sense of failure. If you think of the analogy of scoring a basket in a game, there are non-baskets, there are failed basket attempts, and then there are successful baskets. And in a way, her theory is modeled after that. So she's gonna have the structure of pure non-art, failed art attempts, and art. We'll come back. I mean,
right. Just a quick important point is that, say in basketball, so in fact you don't have this distinction in basketball that if I throw a pass to you, but I'm just an inept passer and I end up putting it in my opponent's goal, right? Then what counts as a goal has nothing to do with the intentions of the people playing the game, right? So there's a worry there that if that's what's going on, then you can't really explain the kind of failure that I think any art theory ought to be able to explain, and that's going to be failure in terms of the intentions of the artist to be realized in the manner they were intended to be realized.
Okay. I mean, notice though that you can. I mean, there is this kind of failure. You can intend to get the ball through the hoop and fail to do it, and that will be a failed. That will be a failed attempt.
That's correct. Yeah, that's what I call a simple failure. The complex failure is the one that I'm worried.
Okay, so maybe we're agreed that her account will make sense of simple failure, and we'll debate about how important. We could debate about how important making sense of complex failure is. We might come back to that if we have time. I think we're agreed. Institutional theories have lots of problems. They face Valheim's dilemma. They have trouble making sense of certain kinds of failure. They have trouble making sense of the solitary artist. And yet, they're still with us. They're not going away. People are still writing essays defending institutionalism. It's still probably the most popular of the essentialist views.
That's right. Well, what do you think is the option for someone that say like myself, who's just finds the anti-essentialist agenda unappealing, and then also finds the institutional theory a non-starter? Where am I to go in philosophy of art?
Yeah. So my strategy would be to suggest that you should just give up on the project and instead do what a number of other philosophers have suggested: get away from focusing on just the philosophy of art, where that just project, and instead start investigating the individual art forms and the individual problems that they raise. So I've done work on the philosophy of comics, and I've written on the philosophy of dance. We've both written on the philosophy of film. You've worked on comics too. I think lots of the most productive philosophical work over the last 15 or 20 years has been work that has focused on the individual art forms.
I agree completely.
From philosophy of music, where a lot was done in those two areas, the latter part of last century.
Right, and I think what's very helpful in this in these areas is that a lot of, or most of the arguments are really independent of whether or not the things we're considering, film, comics, printmaking, dance, are in fact artworks. That ultimately these really interesting philosophical issues run orthogonal to the definitional issue, and so you can do lots of really productive and informative philosophical work in these areas without being held hostage to the definitional question. And I think it's really just a standout in terms of the positive shift in philosophy of art in the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that some people have done and some people have explored is if you're moving away from defining art, you might see if you could define various art forms. So we have had, there's actually a lot of work on defining, trying to come up with a definition of literature.
Right.
There's a bit on the definition of film or the moving image. We have some proposed definition of poetry by Ana Ribeiro. I've argued in a few papers that everyone else's proposed definition of comics is problematic, and we should give up on defining those, attempting to define those. So I guess one point is, I mean, one thing you might do in shifting from the philosophy of art to the philosophy of the arts is you might think, we'll just do the definitional project again. And I think some people are doing that. I think we're both agreed that doesn't seem like that project is so pressing, because you can do lots of interesting things about comics and film without coming up with a definition.
Right.
And in some sense, you've inherited most of the same problems. It's not like it actually gets that much easier to not really to define comics or literature or film or music. You might initially think, maybe I'm not going to have as much variation in functions or something. But actually, if you think about most of these art forms, they're very varied in what people, think of literature, for example. It's so varied.
This is why in some of my recent work, especially my paper with P.D. Magnus, the philosopher of science at University of Albany, we suggested that the problem isn't with the definitional project, isn't essentialism versus anti-essentialism, but rather it's that both essentialism and anti-essentialism are committed to this art concept monism, that there has to be one art concept, and they're just debating as to whether it's classically defined or defined otherwise. So what we suggest is, perhaps a more productive route would be to embrace a art concept pluralism, that there are multiple responsible and productive art concepts that we employ in the discourse, and it's a mistake to hold any particular one of them hostage to all of the demands, extensional or otherwise, that you would hold a definition to if you assume that there is but one art concept. So the idea is that when aesthetic theories, historical theories, institutional theories, representational theories, they all look to be doing really good work within a certain kind of area, and then they experience pretty nasty failures when they're outside of that area. And the idea is that, well, if you're a pluralist about these, then it's not a mark against the aesthetic theories of art, that they can't account for ready-mades and conceptual works and things like that, because they're not supposed to, right? They're productive within this one certain kind of domain, and that way we can sort of not abandon the definitional project altogether, but try to but instead figure out which ones are the productive ones, and then try to flesh those out. And I think that's a far more, that's an ambitious, but it's a far more ultimately philosophically useful kind of approach.
So we have we don't have to think there's only one that would be of interest. Does it mean that so your thought is we then there's the concept of the aesthetic concept of art, and I guess that goes with it is there's a category of aesthetic art, right?
Yeah, it's that. I mean, think about a lot of the works within art history, but prior to say the 20th century, seem to be predominantly interested in sort of aesthetic pursuits. And it's really, again, I mean, this, for every definition, particular kind of definition, it has these kinds of extensional weaknesses. Aesthetic theories really can't capture anti-aesthetic works, right? Works that are never intended to have any sort of aesthetic properties or aesthetic attitudes. Quite the opposite in some cases. Historical ones, run afoul, or excuse me, institutional ones run afoul of, the desert island, artist. Or deserted island artist, outsider art, folk art, and so the idea here is that, this is modeled after species concept pluralism in philosophy of biology. Is that the idea is that there are multiple species concept, and that they all do really good work within a certain kind of domain for certain kinds of inquiry. And so certain ones might be driven by evolutionary ideas that can't account for, like, swamp creatures or robots or something like that. And so they fail in these kinds of thought experimenting cases, but that's not a big deal. Why? Because they're really productive within the domain.
I think this is, I think it's an interesting idea. I do think it raises lots of interesting questions. So questions and concerns. Some questions I would have. Maybe we won't get to talk about all of them. We've got a lot of stuff to talk about. But there's a question about why they all should count as concepts of art.
Right.
There's the question about whether you have lots of different concepts. You might still think there might be an issue of whether some of those concepts are better than others, more useful than others. It's not clear. If you have all these concepts, whether you're just appealing to these different concepts is going to answer the question that lots of people want from their theory of art, which is to tell us which things are art and which aren't, which ones we should care about and which ones aren't. So I wonder if it answers it's a pluralist account is well suited to answer the kinds of questions that people wanted the theory of art for. I guess I also just wonder, what are the constraints on a responsible concept of art?
Right. Well, it's going to have to do some work, right? I can't just willy-nilly posit some feature and then define art in terms of it and say that why is this counted amongst the plurality? The question is, well, what work does it do? And if I can't show that it's productive, and then that itself is sufficient reason not to consider it amongst the responsible plurality. And so you have to be a little careful, because there's the tendency for people to say, well, why are these all art concepts? When in fact what they mean is, why are these, they're back into the sort of monistic conception that, in the idea that, well, this one's better than this one. Now, the better they are, the comparatives have to be within the same domain, right? So we might have competing historical definitions, or the historical oriented concepts, and that's a fair question to ask. Which one's better at capturing, what's motivating, or the inquiry into this particular kind of domain? But it's to ask whether one is better than the other in the plurality is sort of monistically driven, right? One isn't what it is to be a good art concept in this case is just to be productive within the domain of inquiry. And the question is, well, we just need to carve out those domains and then start trying to flesh out what is the best concept to be driving inquiry in those domains.
So you don't think there's any? So I've got this concept which is good in this domain, and this concept which is good in this domain, and you don't think there's any comparison? So maybe this domain is more important than that domain?
Sure. You might be able to structure your concepts in terms of practical advantages, or whether one particular domain is more pressing than the other. I think that's fine. Or you might think one that's art historically driven, right? Is you might think that like an aesthetic theory, right? Won't be able to capture what the pressing sorts of issues that are going to be driving our historical inquiry, right? But it might very well be that the social understanding of art, rather than a historical understanding of art, is more generally pressing for philosophical inquiry, and so you can structure them accordingly. But it's not going to be in terms of which better answers the question, what's art?
Okay. One thing that I'm interested in is that some philosophers think they're defining the concept of art. Some people think they're trying to define, as it were, art itself, come up with necessary sufficient conditions for being art. So that there's the concept of art, or concepts of art, as you've said, and there's art itself. People often make this distinction when when we debate about whether we're doing conceptual analysis or not. People will say, we're not interested in the concept of knowledge, we're interested in knowledge. How does what you're saying of pluralism about concepts of art bear on art?
Well, so it's This is just my general point of view is that if if what you want is a unified, coherent concept, a single concept of art, don't hold your breath, because it's not. There's nothing like that forthcoming. It's a mess, an utter mess, and so you should expect a healthy dose of revision, to be mixed into any kind of results that come out of this. So the pluralism is saying, well, let's try to figure out what seems to be the sorts of important things, and then again you can expect revision within these within the plurality, and let's try to get clear on what particular concepts are driving these issues over here in this domain, and these issues over here in this domain.
Okay, let's talk about this other stuff you've written recently, Christy. Not that we're just interested in you, but you did write this book that I found very interesting, article that I found interesting, in which you claim you're not going to give us a theory of art. You're very open and honest about your resistance. You're not going to give it a definition, but you're going to give us some conditions of what any kind of theory, any kind of definition is going to have to conform to. You claim that any theory of art is going to have to be substantively intention dependent, or show that art is. Right. Can you explain what you mean by substantively intention dependent?
Sure. So the work that I did in the Australasian Journal article, which is Failed Art and Failed Art Theory, that was the genesis for my new book, Art and Art Attempts, is that I have no clue what it is for something to be art. Absolutely none. However, I do know one thing, and that's one thing that I think every philosopher of art will agree to, and that's that art is the product of intentional action, right? It's in some sense, intention dependent, and this is a non-trivial, sort of admission, right? It's not that we don't all cop to this consensus in virtue of some trivial entailment. We think it's something important, and you'll notice that almost every single definition of art that's been offered in the last 40 years, it makes it explicit in some sense. That art is dependent on intentions.
Let me stop you there for 1 second, because it's true that pretty much every theory of art makes intentions essential to art, makes it a intention dependence a necessary condition, and yet you say they don't make it important enough.
Right.
And it's tricky. I find that tricky. When I read it, I was like, well, all of these people make intentions a necessary condition for being art. So what are they missing?
Right. So this is the difference between you're right that they all make it a necessary condition. The question is whether this is a trivial or ad hoc sort of condition, and rather than like a substantive one. So what I claim is that if it's substantive, then it ought to be able to account for basic action theoretic notions like failure and success of an action, right? If artworks have to be the product of intentional action, then, and just in general common sense, art is the kind of thing that you can attempt to make and fail at making it. So I can attempt to make an artwork and fail to make an artwork, or I can succeed at making artwork. And so a substantive sense of intention dependence is going to capture the substantive, non-trivial way in which intentions are directing our actions, and the way in which the world, right, matches up with how we intended the world to be, right? So when I started investigating the extant definitions of art, I started finding that throughout they all have this explicit commitment to intentions, but it turns out that it's not one that can capture this basic notion of failure and success. Either it's impossible to fail to make art, or it's in fact the intentions don't do any work, right? Okay, so let's other than excluding natural objects, right?
Let's talk about kinds of cases. I mean, think of a kind of historical theory of art or a historical theory of poetry. So Levinson's theory of art or Levinson's theory of poetry. Where roughly speaking, the view is to be an artwork, something needs to be seriously intended to relate to the art historical tradition. And then there's a way Levinson has a way of spelling out what it is to be related to the art historical tradition.
Right.
similar, Ana Ribeiro says something, roughly speaking, to be a poem is, for something to be a poem is for it to be a verbal text that's intended to be related to the poetic tradition. Now, I mean, since they do make, it does look like they make the intention to be related to the tradition as something close to a sufficient condition. It's not quite a sufficient condition, because they both include little other conditions. It's hard to see how, if you intended to seriously, non-passingly intended to make your work relate to the art historical condition, you could fail. So I take it that's kind of the worry.
Yeah, it's the kind of failure that
I want to get clear on the kind of failure, because when I was thinking about this, there are ways that Levinson and Ribeiro and various people can make sense of some kind of failure. So they could say you might have a pure intention to make a work of art that you never act on.
Right.
So there's a case in which you had and you didn't act on it, and on Levinson's account, clearly that's not sufficient. He doesn't think a pure intention to make art. So there's some sense of intending and not succeeding that they can make sense of. So just, again, give me exactly the idea of what kind of failure it is that you think they can't make sense of.
So I discussed this in my book, that there's some different senses of failure, right? So when I say that brown dwarfs are failed stars, right, or Jupiter is a failed star, I don't mean it in any action theoretic sense, right? It's a way for me to say it's not, right? That it's something that was approximating the conditions for becoming a star, but did not, in fact, reach those, right? It didn't satisfy. It was close, almost a star kind of thing, right? So, and this is the kind of sense I think that Ribeiro and Levinson have in their historical accounts, that I can have a sort of pure intention that the work be regarded in a certain way, that artworks have been, or poems have been correctly regarded, or in the poetic tradition, and but I fail to act on it, right? Well, that's not, I don't fail to act on it, I just don't act on it. That's just another way of saying, I didn't act on it. What I'm interested in is in which, this basic action theoretic account in which I engaged in some activities that were directed by that intention, with the aim of a certain result obtaining, and either that result didn't obtain, right, or it obtained but not in the manner I intended, right? And they can't account for either of those, because once you get to the that intention is actually directing action point for both Ribeiro and Levinson, it's an automatic success.
Okay, so why is it a problem that intentions in action on their account guarantee success? So it doesn't seem constitutive of the notion of intentional action that there be a possibility of failure. I mean, there's your good old case of intending to intend, where that isn't future directed, but is actually an intention in well, not a future directed intention. Dummett talks about a case, and talks about the following case: I intend to when I say the name Christy, I intend to refer not to you, or I intend not to refer to you, but rather to, who's the Irish folk singer?
Christy Moore.
I intend to refer to Christy Moore and not you. Dummett says, it seems like if I have that intention, I can't fail in at least not referring to you. So there are at least plausible cases. I mean, a complicated case, maybe a case that isn't convincing, would be some of God's creative intentions. It doesn't seem incoherent to have intentional actions that are failure-proof. So why is it an objection against theories of art that they make these art-directed intentions failure-proof?
No, you're exactly right. There are sort of failure-proof intention-directed actions, right? And, intentions not to square a circle or something like that, right? So the problem is that you don't think that art-making intentions are these kind. That should strike anyone as super strange. That when artists are engaging in their practices with the aim of producing art, that the driving intentions are of these goofy kinds of failure-proof sorts, right? That are usually goofy in terms of logically, right? Ensure that failure is impossible. And what I find particularly telling is on both accounts, they make it possible that there could be artworks that it's in principle that absent direct knowledge of the intention, it could be in principle impossible for us to know that they're artworks. So, for example, on Levinson's case, and I use this in my book, I form the right sort of intention that's directing my. So I'm a whittler, and I want to whittle a stick into a fierce mountain lion, and so my whittling activities are directed by this intention. But it turns out I'm a horrible whittler, and so it looks like a stick after I'm done. Or one of my favorite cases is that I have bad eyesight, so as I'm whittling, I'm not actually touching the stick. I'm just floating right above it, unbeknownst to me, and this attracts a bird, and the bird comes down and pecks at the stick, and it just so happens that the result of the pecking is that it looks like a mountain lion, fierce mountain lion. So for Levinson, that's an artwork, and we all think it's an artwork, but in the stick case, it's an artwork, even though no one would ever regard it in the way that it was intended to be regarded. And same with Ribeiro's case, that I might intend it to be a verbal text in the poetic tradition, but the result of my activities could well be something that is in principle impossible to be seen as a verbal text in the poetic tradition. And so that seems weird that there could be that a theory would allow for successful art making, the product of which is an artwork that's in principle impossible to tell as an artwork.
I mean, one of the things you said, though, I can imagine this response. I'm not sure I'm attracted to it, Christy, but I can certainly imagine this response. One of the things you said is no one thinks art making is like this. Is that weird, like these weird and self-fulfilling intentions. But art making is really strange now. Someone might say. I mean, the conditions that we're in with respect to art and poetry are such that there seem to be no constraints, and so someone might say, look, in the conditions that we're in right now, maybe art-making intentions are weird. They're weirdly self-fulfilling. At least, robust acted-on intentions are robustly fulfilling, because after all, that's what's happened to art in the late 20th century, early 21st century. It's been everything else has been been sucked out, and that all we have left of art, the last remaining husk, is just this sort of bare intention to make art, or intention to make poetry.
Right. I see. So I think that that's something that needs to be addressed. But I think that there's a relatively straightforward way to address it, and that's not that there's been some logical or conceptual shift such that art-making intentions are of the same type as the intention not to square a circle, but rather that unlike for the most of art history, where art making was a very highly skilled activity and required years of training to engage in the kinds of activities that artists were typically engaged, is that nowadays with performance art, conceptual art, that there is a de-emphasis on skill and technique, and you have lots of artworks that are within certain domains. It seems really easy to make an artwork. In fact, so easy that it seems almost impossible to fail. But you don't want to take that to be a strict foreclosure on the notion of failure altogether. But I do think you're right that there has been this kind of art historical shift towards activities that seem like it's in fact much harder for those activities to fail than artistic activities, say 100, 200 years ago.
Yeah, I feel the pull of that, Christy, which is why, as you know, I liked the paper when I initially read it. Okay, so that's what you've been doing on the definition of art. Is there anything else we should talk about before we come to an end?
I think so. So while I've been busy on the definitional project, you've been busy sort of staking out new territory for philosophy of art and aesthetics. And I think it would be nice for you to say something about that. Yeah,
so aside from the material I've done on the individual art forms, work on comics and video games, neither of which required me to come up with a definition of comics or a definition of video games. The thing that's interested me most recently has been experimental philosophical aesthetics, engaging in experimental work, which I think my co-authors and I think can shed light on interesting philosophical issues, interesting aesthetic issues. So we've done some work on bad art. There's a well-known phenomenon of the mere exposure effect, which is the phenomenon whereby mere unreinforced exposure to stimuli generates positive attitude towards those stimuli. This has been found to work in the phenomena happens in the case of art, and James Cutting, a psychologist at Cornell, did some really great experiments where he exposed his students to artworks over the course of a semester and showed that mere exposure would manipulate their preferences for impressionist works. So suggesting that maybe one of the major factors in canon formation is just the mere exposure to works of art. Museums and books expose us to certain images, and maybe it's just the exposure that generates our liking for those things. We decided to show people bad art and see what would happen. So we showed them images over the course of a semester of images. We got a really interesting result. Basically, the more we showed them the Kincaid images, the less they liked them. So mere exposure with bad art, we took Kincaid as a pretty clear example of bad art. Mere exposure to bad art looked like, instead of it increasing liking or preference, generating positive attitude, looks like it generates disliking, decreased preference. So,
what are the implications of this for inquiry into things like aesthetic judgment or in canon formation, things like that?
Yeah. So our thought, I mean, in a way, what we were doing was responding to a kind of skeptical argument, which suggested that canon formation and aesthetic judgment might be driven by something that has nothing to do with the artworks themselves and value, but rather this merely contingent matter of exposure. And our study, which suggests that exposure to bad art doesn't generate increased liking or preference, looks like it still leaves the possibility in that judgment and canon formation can be sensitive to something like value, so that exposure can't be doing all the work. That can't be the only variable in the construction of canon formation and judgment. It remains to be seen precisely what is driving the effect. We like to think it was the sheer badness of Kincaid's paintings that caused people to decrease their like. The the more they saw it, the more they realized how bad it was. But obviously, we need to do more work to figure out what, in fact, is driving the decrease in preferences on exposure to these bad paintings. So that's one project. The other project I've been working on recently is on some work that I know you're interested in too, on the semantics of aesthetic adjectives, interested in what kind of gradable adjectives aesthetic adjectives are. And I've got some work that I'm doing now also on the nature of aesthetic testimony, how willing people are to form judgments about artworks on the basis of what other people tell them. So that's been the direction I've been working in lately.
So for anyone who might be unfamiliar, it's what's motivating the testimony work is that it's a standard view that aesthetic testimony is something that is not something through which you can acquire knowledge. Is that there's something goofy about aesthetic testimony that precludes it from imparting knowledge?
Yeah, so the puzzle gets going because on the one hand, it seems like testimony is one of our primary sources of warrant and knowledge. But on the other hand, in the art case, many people have had the thought that testimony, my testimony that some movie is great or that some painting is beautiful, just doesn't seem like it can transmit warrant or knowledge. So it seems odd to think that you could know the painting, to many people, that you could know the painting is beautiful. A painting is beautiful merely on the basis of what someone else says. Now, we're not going to quite address at least in the early work that we're doing, quite addressing the epistemic issue, but we are interested simply in the question of to what extent people do form judgments about aesthetic judgments of value on the basis of what other people tell them. So what we're doing is sort of generating something like rating websites and investigating people's willingness to form judgments on the basis of testimony about, say, aesthetic features of a artwork and as opposed to descriptive features of the artwork.
Well, so I wanted to ask you. All
right, Christy.
Contemporary philosophy of art, at least in the last 15, 20 years, I think has developed this sort of unhealthy tendency towards kind of blind devotion to practice, right? The sort of pragmatic constraint. And this is typically within the ontology of art that any theory about what sorts of what ontic sorts artworks have to be has to be in line and can't. It's this descriptivist constraint that your theory can't run roughshod over practice. Now, when you're doing XFi, this is really engaging with the way the folk think about these sorts of things. To what extent do you think that there's this kind of pragmatic constraint involved in your work, or do you think that as long as you have some kind of appropriate or sufficiently compelling explanation, it's okay to be revisionary in this sense?
I'm not thinking of my work as linked up the experimental work as tightly linked up with this what you call the pragmatic constraint. I mean, yeah, I think I'm probably about as skeptical as you are about whether our ontology of art needs to conform to practices. That just takes us a long way away from this, but I'm not thinking of the kind of experimental work that we're doing as providing the basis for that. I mean, I do think if people are interested in have proposals about what the practices are, it would be worth their while investigating them empirically. But that's not what I'm interested in. No, I'm interested in how whether or not people form judgments, form aesthetic judgments on the basis of what other people tell them. Many people have said they don't, or they don't very often, and I'd like to know whether or not that's true. So Yeah, notice that none of this stuff, this experimental stuff, seems to have anything to do with defining art or even defining the art forms. It's interesting work that one can do in aesthetics and doesn't require the project of defining art.
Yeah. Do you think that the definitional project in some sense has to creep in? So there's a worry that with a lot of the recent work being done in cognitive science, that with issues that are germane to issues going on in philosophy of art, that there's a tendency to make these grand, sweeping claims like the Ramachandran all art is caricature, sort of claim. Is that
No, I don't think you need a definition of art to show what's wrong with that. I think lots of times, I mean, I mentioned it earlier. We didn't talk much about it before. I think a move that Noel Carroll makes, or something that Noel Carroll says in some of his work on the definition of art, is that in many cases, we don't really need a definition of art. We just need a method of identifying art. I think that most of the time we're pretty good at identifying art, and we're able to show what's wrong with some of those very implausible theories of art just by pointing to art without requiring any definition. We have a good idea of what the extension is, even if we don't know if we don't know what the necessary and sufficient conditions, if there are any, are.
Good. Yeah, I think it's helpful to have a working, minimally sort of productive and informative notion of what art has to be. That's informing these kinds of inquiries, but that you don't need a complete definition.
Okay.
But I think it's great that these kinds of work is being directed by people in philosophy of art. That in fact can use that you've already in fact engaged with a lot of these issues and have well-reasoned positions that can inform the sort of empirical results and the implications thereof. So yeah, I think that what you're doing is the way in which this kind of inquiry needs to be conducted. Yeah, I think it's great.
All right, Christy. I've got to get out to eat some dinner and then go see some art, maybe a movie if I can work it out. So I think we should call it quits. It's been lots of fun talking.
It's great talking to you.
And I hope to see you in person sometime soon.
Yeah, hopefully that'll be the case. But yeah, great conversation, and I'll talk to you later.
Okay.